Boardroom Bound, episode 173, How to Leverage the Brain Power of Your Board with Bill Adams and Dan Taylor.
When you're constructing a board, understand that diversity is an enormous part of being able to leverage diverse brain power. And if it gets too homogenized, you will find that you lose the power of a board.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring and existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's episode, we're speaking with two people, one of those rare episodes here, Bill Adams and Dan Taylor. And they're going to talk about their deep experience both working together on one organization, but also experience outside of that. For example, Bill has been on 4 public company boards for NASDAQ. He's chaired several of them, other nonprofit boards. We're going to talk about, he's got a very special book offer he's going to give for the first 50 listeners on the show to write him. He will give a signed copy of his upcoming book. So much content to dig into today. Actual advice we can all use as we seek a board seat. Before we jump into today's show, I'd like to share a message from our sponsor about board director education and certification. Want to join your first board or looking for additional board seat opportunities? In either scenario, be sure to be disciplined in your approach through the Becoming an Exceptional Board Director Candidate Education and Certification course. Get both the modern board director candidate packaging and modern board operations knowledge integrated with one program. Remember, the key to landing additional or your first board seat is in your packaging. Make the effort to do it right. Program graduates also receive their globally recognized International Board Director Competency Designation upon course completion, available in one-on-one, group, or on-demand registration options. You can learn more at bit.ly, that's bit.ly/IBDC-D. So bit.ly/IBDC-D. And now, let's jump into the show. Bill Adams and Dan Taylor, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Thank you for having us. We're pleased to be here.
Well, this is a special treat. We usually don't have 2 people together, so we're going to have double the advice and thoughts and feedback and guidance packed into one episode today. There's so much to get through. This is great. Plus a special offer, sort of sneak peek for our audience at the end. Big, great book offer that's coming out. But before we jump into the show, Bill, I'll let you go first and Dan second. Give us a very brief overview of your career arc, especially into the boardroom space, and then we'll start digging into some of that today.
Sure. Let me start out. Going back to my youth, I spent several years working for Fortune 50 companies and worked my through the organization, wound up being the director, decided to leave, begin my first consulting firm, which since then I built and sold 2 management consulting firms. Last one I sold to Dell Pro Systems for pre-IPO stock. Once it went public, I was able to leave that firm. I started what I currently still have today in '98, a consulting firm called White Space, and its specialty was providing organizational transformation and change. And as an innovation leader, I had a lot of opportunities to do interim CEO assignments in mostly NASDAQ firms in the technology and the healthcare space. So during my career, I've had the opportunities to work with the senior executives and the board level, and often, in 6 cases, I was invited to be on the board. In some cases, I was the interim CEO and the chair of the board to do reorganization, insider buyout, to SEC challenges to stabilize the company. So I've seen a lot of what comprises a good board and a bad board. I pulled that forward when I started Target Tech, which goes back now about 6 years ago. And I always knew I was going to be forming a board When I did do that, I've already had in hand a process that I use, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about it, the 3 Ps. But my avail to be on so many boards, forming boards, working with boards, chairing boards, was really an extension of all of the management consulting that I was doing at senior levels.
And Dan, how about yourself?
A pleasure to be with you today, Alexander. I began my career after college with American Express, and it was a 22-year ride with them, both running operations and systems organizations, both domestically and internationally. And after American Express, joined a couple other large companies. First was T-Mobile, which formerly was VoiceStream before it was acquired by Deutsche Telekom. And then joined Concur Technologies, one of the largest expense management service provider in the world. And basically, after 40 years, decided I would use my experience and know-how in the consulting field, and so started my own company, Guidescent, and that was about 3 years ago is where I first met Bill Adams and was introduced to him and learned all about what he was doing as his vision. And it was then that I made the leap to join the board. So it's been a fascinating ride thus far with Targa, and we look forward to speaking with you about it later on today.
So this is going to be a lot of fun for our audience, in some way sort of pulling back the curtain of what it looks like in the boardroom, what it feels like, how we choose people to be in the boardroom. And maybe, guys, we should start out talking about sort of Target Tech, right? So, Bill, you talked before about all this work you've done sort of helping other organizations, individuals figure like how the board should be set up, how they should be most efficient, and how they should collaborate. So when you're thinking about the Target Tech board, and we know that Dan is your longest tenured board member there, so you probably have a lot of insights we're going to be able to share about how that board works best, how it was set up. But also, let's think about sort of, Bill, maybe we start at the high level. You're thinking about, I'm going to build a board, and I've talked to lots of people about the problems they've had in a boardroom. What is that perfect board like? And then we'll get to thinking about how do you find the right people to put in place around it?
Well, I mean, the perfect board is really about brain power, and how do you leverage the brain power? How do you pull them together? How do you have the right combinations? One of the no-nos that I saw on boards that did not work very well was a very homogeneous board. So to give you an example, I worked with an organization that was a high growth $60 billion organization that Wall Street had got very interested in. And the board was peppered with only Wall Streeters that had no experience in operations. Now, the CEO, who was a turnaround artist, was asked to package the company up and get it sold. Spent 3 years. It was very difficult. And he often lamented to me that the boards don't help because their only interest was money. And there is a good case where you don't want to homogenize a board because it becomes myopic. Where had the board been more versatile in the backgrounds, 3 areas specifically that I look for, and that is the pedigree of the individual that you bring on, the persona of the individual, which includes obviously, the characteristics, the mannerisms, and how they conduct themselves. And then the last one is participation. How willing and able are they to participate? With participation also, what I found is that the way to get someone's attention and keep it that sits on the board, they should invest in the company. So all of my board has invested the exact same amount of money. It only depended on their equity position, just depended on when they came into the board. So when you're constructing a board, understand that diversity is an enormous part of being able to leverage diverse brain power. And if it gets too homogenized, you will find that you lose the power of a board.
Bill, it's interesting when you started out saying boards being homogenized. I imagine many in our audience were going, "Oh, pale, male, and stale." I've heard that before. I know what that looks and feels like. And when you're using the word diversity there, I think many of us are probably hearing what we've traditionally heard. It shouldn't be all male, or we should also have people of different backgrounds and experiences. I think the key thing you're also saying is also so your intellectual horsepower, that subject matter expertise you bring, so we can tap into different things. You talked about the one that had just finance people and no operations. So can you elaborate a little bit for us? And then I'm going to bring in Dan to this conversation for his experience joining that board.
Sure. I mean, look, the fact of the matter is you have a board for two reasons. You have a board to govern. What you're really governing is the day-to-day business. And that is historically, and I don't know how many of your listeners know this, but if they read the paper, which is on my website as a part of my blog, you will find that boards started in the 16th century, and the word literally comes from the table they met around. That was the original board. The first findings of board of directors goes back to 1712, where then it went from the board itself to the board members. And when that started, governance was the key word in 1712, which still is today. And that's about governing, over the operation. However, we live in a collaboration age where Michael Porter from Harvard said it best in one of his books, where he says instantaneous equates to competitiveness. You, as a senior executive putting a board together, you have to decide how you're going to get the board to also be involved in moving the organization forward. Now, that's a different assignment from governance. And what I'm finding working with all these different executives that have boards, trying to get more out of their boards, they're not understanding that these two components are distinct and separate from each other. Governance over the existing business is one thing. Moving the organization forward is something else. And the most critical aspect to cross that bridge so that the executive team is getting real help in both areas is diversity. And I don't just mean ethnic diversity, although that is extremely important. I'm talking about divergency in the brain power. That's where you really have to hone in your understanding as you are interviewing for your board, bringing board members on, that you're really looking for the diversity to bring different perspectives to the table, what was originally called the board.
Now, Dan, if we take this interesting history of the boardroom space and evolve it to today, when you were getting recruited by Bill basically to join his board and that invitation was out there, I would love to hear a bit of your experience to set up today's conversation, right? So you were probably, based on what Bill said here, he was giving you some clear expectations, perhaps, of what it was going to look like to be in his board. And how has it felt since then in your experience, say, over the multiple years that you've been in that role with the organization? This has grown and developed, and maybe how your experience has changed. Just Bill talked about now, there's a difference between governance and I'll call it like helping with the long-term strategy.
Yes. Well, it really started, my journey with Target started as an investor when I first met Bill. And, I was very enthralled with the potential for what he was trying to build, not only from a company perspective, but as a service. Owning my own consulting practice, I could see that a lot of my clients and other organizations, and even in my own past experience, organizations struggled with leadership and being able to drive high levels of performance and get business results. So my attraction to Target was, first and foremost, the product, coming in as an investor, but working with Bill and learning about what he was doing, the excitement built up in my own persona of saying, wow, he's onto something. I would like to do more than just be a passive investor in this enterprise. And so that's when our conversation shifted to, hey, would I be a good fit for a board position? And after several conversations, we agreed that I could bring a lot of things to the table. And I think it's really important from someone considering whether they're going to join a board, which is my situation, is number one, are you totally bought into what the company is about? Do you believe in the mission? Do you believe in the products and services that they're out there to offer? And in my particular case, given Target was an early stage company, was I willing to commit the time, the necessary time to help the organization get to the next level of their evolution? So that was really the stimulus and the background that brought me forward to join the board. And then we can talk a little more about what it's been like over the last 2.5 years, really working side by side with Bill and other members of the board that he brought together.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. And Bill, let me bring you back in here because I know something that you get really excited about is when you think about, say, back to your own career experiences, you've grown and developed over time. If you were probably doing it again, you'd probably talk about, having a better understanding of what is involved in helping govern current operations and help an organization move toward them so that the board better serves stakeholders and shareholders and customers alike. And so when you were establishing this board and you were talking about getting the right intellectual horsepower around it, how did you go about making sure all of that happened? And Dan's probably a great example of it.
Well, yeah, it's you're walking a fine line between companies in early stages especially need money, so they're looking for money. They get private investors, and they jump into private investor because the private investor has money. And the fact of the matter is, I have seen organizations where that is sometimes the worst executive move you'll ever make. Because if you don't have the 3 Ps coordinated, if the pedigree of the individual, like Dan's pedigree, came from operations, and it was serious operations, he ran enormous organizations, that pedigree meant a lot to the forward movement of our organization and over the governance of operations. The second thing is Dan's persona. So I looked at his character, his background. When you start testing it, and I always advise executives when you're getting aboard, don't be afraid to get in the candidate's head. You've got to put them in situations, ask them questions, ask them tough questions, put them on the defensive in the sense that you're trying to elicit from them, what is their persona going to be like under pressure? So yeah, you bring them on the board, and always remember that when you're interviewing a candidate, they're putting their best foot forward. Now you got to figure out a way to say, when we're under pressure as a team, and we got to make serious decisions, how are they going to hold up? Can they hold up? And the third thing is participation. No one on our board does not participate. They all participate. I set up 5 committees, very critical. If you want to have a very powerful board, understand there's no better way than setting up and commanding committees and get your board members to be the chairs. And that goes from SMBs, small to mid-sized companies, all the way through the big companies. Every NASDAQ company I sat on, they had committees. But if you take a look at the 3 Ps as you bring the board members, if you see their pedigree, their education, and their backgrounds, and then their persona, how do they hold up under tough questions? Can you get through the veil to see how they're going to be under pressure? Then finally, if they're willing and able to participate, to be on committee, all my board members have to sit, it's mandatory, on 2 committees. And the ones that want to volunteer to be the chair of a committee, they all step forward, and we made them the chairs of the committee. This is critical to understanding how to tap into the brain power. Understanding as an executive team that your job is just not to bring on a board and potentially take their money. Your job is then to figure out how do you put them to work. That's the most important job of a CEO of a company and the chair of a board that is looking to really optimize the brain power of the board.
Now, this is really helpful for our audience because all of them who want to land a board seat or another board seat are going to be going through that interview process. But there's also sort of the flip side of that. I'll call it due diligence, right? Because it happens in both directions. So here we're hearing Bill, who's someone who's putting together a board, what his experience and thought process is going to be interviewing someone. So Dan, you almost can take the flip side of that because you're going through the interview process, like Bill said, trying to put your best foot forward, but you're also assessing the opportunity, the company, the board. Is this a place where I'm a fit, that I can add value, where I'm going to have a good experience, where I'm going to enjoy the time as well? So maybe you can give us the flip side about not only how you did your best job putting yourself forward, because that interview practice can be helpful for others, but how you went about thinking about the due diligence to make sure you're putting yourself into a good situation.
Yes, you're absolutely right, Alexander. It is the flip of what Bill just mentioned, because when I was going through the process, I was also assessing him in very much the same way. You know, what was his persona, what was his background, his track record, and what was the company that he was trying to create going to be all about. And so I had the opportunity to sit down with him at length and also ask the tough questions, probe, and really, both as an investor and both as a contributor, really wanting to make sure that this thing had legs, that it was really going to be a going concern. And looking at the reaction and evaluating that would ensure that it was going to be a good fit. And the second piece was actually testing the product, testing the service, seeing it both from a demonstration and a capability perspective to say, is there something behind the words? Is there really, how much thought has gone into where this company is, particularly since it's an early stage company? And once you get satisfactory answers to that, then the comfort level just rises so much more to say, I know it's going to be a good fit. It's like applying for any other organization in a lot of ways. I know it's going to be a good fit both ways. And I knew I would be in a very comfortable environment, and that anything I would offer up as suggestions or a contradiction of things would be openly and warmly received and respected.
Now, Bill, I would love your thoughts. We're sort of describing here a small, fast-growing company that's growing and developing, and that's a very different experience than some of the others we've referenced so far in the show, saying being on a NASDAQ, where you've got a public company. And there are clearly some legal distinctions of what a board needs to do, but in some ways, you might need a different type of person, maybe a different evolution in their space as a board member. Give our audience sort of your perspective, having been behind the scenes and chairing multiple public company boards, the difference perhaps of what people should be looking for, because I often hear from someone on being a board, they're envisioning a public company, but there are multiples more private companies. There's so many different types of structures as well. Help our audience sort of understand what they might be thinking of between those two different types of board experiences.
Well, that's a good point. The fact of the matter is everybody just assumes if there's a board, it's a public company. That's not the case. Actually, there are probably more private companies with boards than there are public companies with boards if you bend it all out globally. So just because someone is a private company, as we are right now. We are a private company, but we're a Delaware C corporation, and we operate just like I would operate a $500 million board, which I sat on in the NASDAQ, in the technology space. We operate the same way. So while the first reaction of most people with the board is, oh, it's a public company. Actually, it's quite the opposite. There are many, many private companies, and I've sat on two private boards, which is not on my CV, but I have sat on two private boards. I've seen how they work, and these were turnaround situations that I was involved with. So being public is not a criteria for creating a strong board. Now, where a company is in their life cycle is critical to the kind of board that they have. What happens to boards, over time, they wear down. They don't have fresh thoughts. I've seen this time and time again. And we have to also be careful of one thing. There are candidates in boards that accept this laissez-faire, passive relationship. Give me my options I earned during the year, and thank you very much. That is crippling to the forward movement of any organization, be it public or private. But just be aware that you could be a private company and be in your own board and do the exact same thing we did at Target Tech. Start from scratch, start with a piece of paper, create a business, move it forward, mature it to the point where you realize, okay, we now are ready to assemble our board to take us to the next level. And that's exactly what many leaders out there that are running private companies should be considering, because the power of a board can be enormous, especially if the two things happen. You have an investment, right? They're invested in the proposition. And second is they understand how and why participation is critical to the long-term success.
Bill, something else I'd love for you to give perspective on. You have been both the chair of public company boards and probably also nonprofit boards and other types of boards. You've also been the CEO who's sitting on the board. Now, a new board member really wants to build very strong relations with both of those key people. There are some organizations where that person is both roles, but let's assume that that's probably not the case. But would love for you to think about the responsibilities that you have as the chair and responsibilities you have as the CEO and what the ideal board member is to be working with you, right? For example, in the CEO, you need someone who knows their space and they're not supposed to come over the thin red line and try to manage day-to-day operations with you because that's your job, not their job. Help us understand how someone is a good board member and builds relationships with both those two key people.
Well, and that's another great question. I mean, the fact of the matter is I see them as two distinct roles, and I've already mentioned the two roles that it should be concentrated on. So I happen to be the chair and the CEO of the company. So let's take that combination, right? I have two distinct roles. My chair role is to move the organization forward, which I talked about earlier. My CEO role is to govern the business. So I see what I'm doing as either moving the organization forward, working with my board, with these committees, all of them sitting on committees and sitting cross committees and then chairing committees. All of that is moving the organization forward. As CEO, my responsibility in my company is strategic in nature. So Dan was a board member who stepped up and is now the president and CEO of the company. He's running the day-to-day operations and does an unbelievable job. So he went from board member to president, COO of the company after he proved his mettle working on the board for almost 3 years. So distinguish yourself. So if there are two separate people, I've got a chairman of the board to deal with. That chairman ought to be working with the board or the candidate on the board or the board member should be working with the chair differently than they work with the CEO. Because the CEO is really about governing the operation, right? Strategically. That's what I do. What Dan does, he governs the operation tactically. He's running the day-to-day operations. My job is to make sure that strategically, from a business model and a technology perspective, we're making the right moves, and it requires my sanction to change any strategic direction of the organization. So I separate them that way. It's the same. It goes back to the same thing, though. One governs the business, and the other one moves the organization forward.
Dan, I'm going to invite you back in here, and I'm going to use a term. So some people, if you're only in America, you think about like a board director, maybe an independent director. If you're in other parts of the world, they use the term non-executive director, NED, which is absolutely clear what it means. You are not, say, an officer of the company. You're an outsider. And then the contrast is executive director. So someone like yourself, Dan, who is in the business, one of the main leaders, the president, COO. Give us a sense also what that looks and feels like for your role where you're on the board. In the same way, you have these two hats. You're in the business, you're on the board, and maybe talk about the experience of being a board member in that space, because that will be the case for some of people listening to this or aspiring to be that, but also how you can best interact with other board members and how they can best interact with you.
Sure. Really, as I started with being solely on the board before taking on an operational role, as Bill mentioned, it was all about in service of moving the business forward. And my participation in that regard was twofold. One was chairing the Customer Experience Committee, which was an idea I had and that Bill endorsed, and also being a very active member of the technology committee, because a lot of the enablers to delivering frontline customer service and product delivery is so dependent on technology. And so in that regard, as a board member at first, I was all about what are the plans, what are the major milestones that we're trying to achieve, do we have the right players that are being assembled to be put in charge and drive. Well, when I pivoted also then to taking on the president and COO role, certainly became more tactical. I now had people directly reporting to me within the organization that I did not have before. So I went from just an influencing type of role, guiding role, to more of I'm now your direct leader. I'm providing day-to-day direction and moving things as quickly as we can. Now, upon reflection, having both those roles, I find very powerful from the standpoint that it's very easy as any leader in a company to get down into the details, being, the firefighting, the day-to-day aspects of it, of maybe forgetting or not focusing enough on strategy. Well, being on the board, working with this diverse group of board members that we have, and focusing on how do we continually move the business forward, brings you back up that level, gives you that broader picture, and then also reinvigorates oneself to go back in the next day to say, okay, I've got renewed faith in what we're doing, how we're going to do it. Let's go back to the tactical operation. So I think having a foot in both can work very powerfully if you embrace that opportunity.
Well, one of the things that we've talked about today, and I love the way you explained it, Bill, was sort of getting the right mental horsepower around the room so people can collaborate, so boards can be really effective in their participation, which is, as you said, is clearly required, as it should be for all board members. And Bill, I'm conscious that you've got some big news coming up. You've got a book coming out called Outfocus, which is all about harnessing the power of collaboration. I think the book is being published June 14th, and you have a special offer for our listeners to take advantage of after the show. Can you tell us about the book and the offer you're giving to them?
Sure. I'm very proud of this. The Forbes books, which only takes about 50 authors a year, accepted me as one of their 50 choices for 22. So Forbes book is publishing the book as we speak. It's officially coming out on June 14th. However, over the next 5 to 10 days, I am to receive 300 advanced copies. They're called advanced author copies, and that's for a signature. What I'm doing is I'd like to offer 50 free signed copies to anyone who sends me an email and requests it. So it'll be the first 50 people that request a signed copy of the book for free. It's shipped for free, and we'll have the opportunity to be able to be, if you will, ahead of the publication date, which is officially June 14th. On that date, it'll be available in Barnes & Noble, Amazon, all outlets. It'll be available on recording, and it is actually the first in a series. So what Forbes has negotiated with me is to do a series of 3 books. This is the first. The second one is going to be called Outposition, and the third one is going to be called Outperform. And it's a series of books, and they're very relevant for senior execs and boards. To read this book will give you a different perspective on the deep-seated link between collaboration, performance, and excellence. And what the book will do for you is to give you if you will, an understanding of the underlying dynamics behind the importance of getting collaboration right. And that includes at the senior level, at the board level. The better you collaborate, the better chance you have of maximizing performance and moving an organization closer towards excellence. So I am offering 50 copies to your listeners, and they'll be signed. And then for those of you who do not make the cut line of the 50, the book will be available on June 14th. And again, it's being published by Forbes Books.
And all they have to do, Bill, is email you. So it's Bill Adams, which is badams, ADAMS, at Targatech, TARGATEK.com. We will have a link to that in the show notes if you're driving and you can't write that down. But again, the first 50, very kind, free signed copy from Bill. And Bill, that was a writing piece, but you've got some more stuff that you do. You've got your Boards That Work series, and we referenced earlier, we will link to this in the show notes. You've got your blog, which the first one there is the Talent Stacking Board. So tell us a little bit about this stuff as well.
Yes, about the blog. Are you asking?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes.
If you go to my LinkedIn site, I write a blog. About every 2 to 4 weeks. They're 2,000 to 3,000 word blogs. There are also articles. Newsweek is right now negotiating with me to do an article for them on boards, and it's a chance for me to be able to communicate to the world my 30 plus years of experience working with and being on and forming boards, and what it means to the senior leadership teams to get it right. That's what when I step in as an interim CEO because the company has problems and they need someone to stabilize the ship. And I used to go in there. In most all cases, I found the boards were ineffective and they were inefficient. In almost all cases. And that I saw is a critical indicator because culture starts at the board level. Boards usually don't talk about this, but when you're moving your organization forward, understand building the right culture is part of your responsibility. And helping the senior leadership team to figure out where to move the culture as the organization moves forward is indispensable. So this is where participation is so important. It's not an arm's length participatory system that I like to set up with the board. It is truly helping from the culture, from the top down, form the culture of the organization as it moves forward.
Well, Bill and Dan, we were delighted to have both of you on this show today. Thank you for sharing your large volume of insights and helping all of us to be boardroom bound.
We appreciate being here, and we look forward to the 51st that sign up to send them a free book.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really had great fun having both Bill and Dan on the show today. So many great insights that we can all use to think about how do people who are chairs or CEOs think about the people they want to be on the board, and then how do we best present ourselves as a candidate, do the due diligence to make sure we're on the right board. And of course, Bill gave that fabulous offer. The first 50 people who email him will get a free signed copy of his book, coming out June 14th, called Outfocus. He'll even ship it to you for free. So Bill Adams' email address is badams, ADAMS, badams at Targatech, TARGATEK.com. We'll have a link to this in the show notes, and you can find the show notes and also links to his white paper and other resources over at podcast.corden.edu. Now, please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast to miss any of the high-quality content that we're bringing to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.